Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. In this video we're going to do something that I never do and I really resisted, but we're going to do it anyway because I couldn't figure out how to get around it, and that is copy basically a photo that somebody else took. Now it's not an intellectual property issue. This is a royalty-free photo that we have permission to use. You've already seen it. It was in the last article. We're going to give a photo credit. So that's not the reason why you hear me talking about not working from photos all the time. And I realized that I very often say I don't work from photos normally in my own work, but I don't go into any more explanation usually. And I'm afraid that that has the risk of kind of coming across as sort of an elitist or snobby statement, like if you were a real artist, you wouldn't need the photo, you could just invent it all out of your head. And that's definitely not what's happening in my studio. I use photos all the time. I just use photos in a mindful way. So I want to say a little bit about why I'm always talking about not always just copying photos. So the first thing I should say is, if you're copying photos because you're approaching watercolor as kind of a project-based hobby, and all you really want is that outcome, and you enjoy the process of copying the photo, then fine, there's not a problem. But if you eventually would like to get to the point where you can design your own paintings, be more creative with them, you have to be careful, because always copying photos is training you to do certain things in a certain way. And some of those are skills that you'll need, and some of those are actually going to interfere with being able to eventually get to the point of creating your own expressions in watercolor. And the reason why I get so adamant about this and talk about it so much is because I've talked to many people who painted for a long time and worked really hard to develop a high level of skill in watercolor, and then quit because they felt like they would never be able to make that leap from copying photos. And it was because they had this huge level of technical skill and no confidence in making creative choices. And that doesn't have to happen. So I want to save you from that. So there are some traps that you can fall into, and I want you to use photos mindfully so that hopefully you don't get caught in those traps. So the first one is that when you're working from a photo, if you're using it kind of as your blueprint, a whole bunch of creative choices have already been made. So part of the issue is you're not practicing making those creative choices, but in fact, most of you come to watercolor, actually, I would say almost all human beings come to watercolor well equipped to make creative choices. You make creative choices everywhere in your life. You have since you were a little kid. You're just not confident about making them in watercolor. And if you saw people making creative choices in watercolor, that didn't work out, and they try something else and that didn't work out, and accepting it as just part of the normal process, you probably would develop that confidence kind of on your own. But that's not what you see. You see a whole bunch of people around you also doing the task of, let's see how accurately we can copy this photograph. And so that becomes the model kind of in the back of your mind to measure yourself against. So you don't bother with the creative decisions. And when the painting isn't satisfying, you accuse lack of technical skill as the reason, because what else are you going to measure it by? I mean, that was the only thing you had to do, was be technically accurate. But the real reason why it's not satisfying might be that the original photo wasn't all that exciting, or that you didn't have an emotional connection to bring out that maybe the photographer did. And that's kind of an elusive thing. If you're not making subtle creative choices, and asking yourself, what do I want to express, you don't have much chance of getting there. So I think it's good, even if you mostly feel like you want that, blueprint to work from, to do something that helps you remember that you have the control here. You get to make those creative choices, and you should consider whether you want to. Very often, creative choices take a little effort. So if you don't object to something in the photograph, then you're likely to just leave it alone, even if it's not the creative choice you might have made with your way of looking at the world if this hadn't been presented to you already kind of figured out. So I encourage you, if you're going to work from photos, to at least start tiptoeing towards making some changes or questioning whether you would have made the same creative choices and trying some different ones. And the consequence of that is you're going to have a lot of things that don't work out. But please don't call them failed paintings any more than, well, occasionally you might have one that you think is a failure, but you order a meal in a restaurant and it's not your favorite thing, you just don't order it again the next time. You don't feel like you're a terrible, I don't know, restaurant goer because you didn't choose the right meal. You go to see a movie and it's not as exciting as you hoped. Oh, well, And this is the same thing. You're doing this for your own enjoyment. And if you try to make a change and it doesn't work out, that's not a failure. That's good information to file away for the next attempt. And gradually you learn to figure out more of what, I like those two colors together. Those are my favorites. I'm going to use them again. I don't care for those. I'm not going to use that. That color's banished from my palette. I don't find it interesting to paint that subject that my friend's so excited about. You learn those things about yourself and you become better at making those choices. And you practice those things more when you don't just accept what somebody else has given you. So that's the first reason. The other pitfall, the almost more dangerous trap in a way, I think, is you train yourself to do certain things while you're painting when you're copying photos that you really don't want to do most of the time. And the worst one is you train yourself to always keep your attention right at the tip of your brush. Because probably one of the most reliable ways to make an accurate transcription of a photograph is to draw everything very carefully and then work very carefully section by section. This is why people draw those grids and work box by box. So working on one tiny little section, focusing on getting it exactly right and then connecting it to the next one is a good way to get a pretty accurate transcription. Or drawing a whole lot and then carefully coloring in between the lines. That's a skill that you need occasionally to be able to get down and focus on fine detail, but you also need to develop the habit, which most of us don't have naturally, of very often stepping back and taking in the painting as a whole and reminding ourselves of what we were after, what we wanted to express, how we felt about this, why we were inspired to paint it in the first place. That's a habit that you have to develop as a painter. You have to develop some systems for yourself that make you pause, take a step back, hold the brush, in abeyance for a moment and think about what you're going to do next and whether that next brush stroke is actually going to help convey what you want to convey rather than reproduce what's on the page. So if you want to paint more expressively, use your brush more expressively, be better with color, all of those things require you to step back and take the painting in as a whole the way a viewer would take it in. But if you look around most painting classes and painting groups, what you see is this, the top of everybody's head, because their noses are down on the page, like just barely on top of the brush. No one looks at paintings that way, except other painters trying to reverse engineer them. You come in and you look at a painting, people stand at a distance that allows them to take the painting in as at a whole. They just naturally do that. So that's the distance you should be using, and a little closer, a little farther, to evaluate how things are going and what you still want to add. So what you actually learn, if you use the standard of how accurately can I copy this, what you train yourself to do is to focus your attention on the tip of your brush, and that means you're training yourself to overwork every painting. And most of us do not want to train ourselves to do that because that's how overwork happens. You get in there and you go, section by section, and you never take a step back. So if you're going to work from photos to practice a skill or a technical exercise, first of all, ask yourself, what is it that is your goal, and make it specific. It's not to do a good painting. It's not to use my colors well. It's to make believable shadows on an orange rose. That's what we're practicing. And then remind yourself to not get trapped into putting your nose down on the page and never taking a step back and asking yourself, you know, how does it look as a whole? That's going to be important for creating a good illusion of depth anyway. We're going to try to beat the photo at the illusion of depth. So with those caveats, let's have a look at this photo and talk about what the task is and why this is a commonly challenging task, which fortunately has a not too challenging solution. So when we look at a close-up scene like this, what do our eyes use as cues to tell us what's closer and what's farther away? Well, one of them is what's in and out of focus. And in this case, the rose is pretty well all in focus. And the things that are out of focus are the leaves and the mulch or whatever is on the ground. And we're going to kind of ignore that in focus, out of focus element for this video and put our attention instead on the rose itself. So within the rose, if we're looking at the various petals, we use basically two cues to tell us what's in front of something else. We follow an edge, and if we can kind of predict the shape of that edge and it gets interrupted, then the thing that's interrupting it must be in front of it. And if something is casting a shadow on something else, then the thing that's casting the shadow must be in front. So the overlap of the petals isn't going to be a problem for us to recreate because we can simply trace the outlines of the petals, so we'll get them overlapping in the right way as far as edges are concerned. It's the shadows that we really have to figure out. How do we create believable shadows on this object that's sort of a yellow-orange? So shadow information is mostly conveyed by value, which we can see when we look at the black and white version, and we still see the depth. This is a particular problem for things like yellows because yellow paint straight out of the tube isn't a particularly dark value. Each of these strips shows the darkest value that I could get with that pigment, with that paint, and then lighter values. So you see with yellow, we really only have a couple of values to work with. What do we do about that? So one solution might be to add black or neutral tint, and that would give you a darker version or darker versions of that same color that you started with. But unfortunately, that doesn't usually look very believable. And the reason is real shadows on yellow, orange, and red objects, or pale pink also, are generally still fairly colorful, and their color varies a little bit. Let's look at some examples where I've pulled out some colors from these shadows on yellow and orange objects. And you can see on the daffodil, we would probably call those shadows some form of green. The yellow poppies or orange poppies have darker orange and maybe brownish tones in their shadows. Really dark areas on yellow objects generally come across as some form of brown. And for red or pink objects, we get things like browns and maroons and magentas. When we isolate them and pull them out like this into little dots, we can see the color and name it and probably do a pretty good job of mixing it. But when we just look at the object as a whole, our brain makes adjustments for what we know the rest of the colors are, and it says, no, that's not greenish, that's darker yellow. And that's how our vision is supposed to work. Our brain knows what the base color of the object is, and it's compensating for the different lighting conditions and telling you it's the same color. So as painters, what we need to do is help our eyes out and take away those other nearby cues so that we can see what the color is that we're really trying to mix. And the way to do that is to take a paper punch and punch a little hole, or cut a little hole if you don't have a paper punch, in a piece of white watercolor paper. Use the same paper you're painting on, and then use it as a viewfinder to really see what colors you're trying to mix in each area. So the first tip is to use a tiny little viewfinder like this to isolate just a little bit of the color and see what it is you really need to mix. Okay, so we're using our viewfinder to figure out what color we're really looking at so we know what we're trying to mix. And now we need to pick some pigments for this painting. So what I recommend you do is choose a red, a yellow, and a blue, and use just that to do the whole painting. And this painting, it should be possible with almost anybody's palette to do that. So for a painting like this, most people would look at my palette and say, well, let's use the sort of orangey yellow that's already almost the right color and add a little additional red and then just pick a blue, so cobalt blue, for example. But you could also use colors that are kind of contradictory to what you think you need as long as they're bright enough. So this is a bright yellow, but it's a yellow that leans a little bit towards the greenish side. So it's not what you'd normally choose to mix an orange. But it's going to work because it's bright enough, even if I put it with a bad choice of red. So let's suppose I choose something really horrible like Quin Magenta, which is way over on the purplish side. So this is the opposite of what you would normally do. You would try to choose a yellow that leans towards red and a red that leans towards yellow. But because these paints are both fairly bright to begin with, we still get an orange that would be plenty bright enough for this painting for the lighter areas. And if we can manage the lighter areas of the petals, the shadows will be just fine. They'll work out. To get the shadows, what we're going to do is add some form of blue, and that can be almost any crazy choice of blue too. In fact, let's try something that isn't even a blue at all. I'll add some phthalo turquoise as my third color. So this isn't really a video about making your color choices for a particular painting, but the point I want to make is even with those crazy choices of initial colors that most people wouldn't start with, I'm getting all the colors that I need for this particular painting. And that's true of probably 95% of paintings. And I'm belaboring this a little bit, even though this isn't a video about how to mix every color in the universe, because very often what happens when you're struggling to get the results that you want is you think the solution is to pick a different color or go buy a different color. And very often you're told that's the solution, and that is incorrect. Usually the problem is either the values aren't right, or you just really aren't seeing which color you're actually trying to mix because you're not using the little viewfinder. So use your little viewfinder. Now, as far as figuring out how to mix those individual colors, one thing you can do is make yourself some little swatch cards to kind of get the hang of mixing the colors that you do choose. So I'm going to use, in this case, I'm going to use the primary triad from Watercolor Jumpstart because I think many of you have those colors or something similar. So this is M grams Azo Yellow, M grams Quinacridone Rose, and M gram Cobalt Blue. So I'm going to start on my little card by mixing a range of yellow oranges to red oranges, and my goal right now is first to see if I can get the kind of colors that I want for the brighter parts of the petals. So it looks like this pair is going to work pretty well. And now to get a shadow version of this color, what I'm going to do is add a tiny, tiny bit of the complement. And you saw I just barely touched my brush, and that was almost too much. So it doesn't take very much of the complement to push that brighter color to the shadow color. And it's a pretty easy thing to do, but it takes a little practice to not add too much. So what I recommend you do is tape off a postcard in quarters, both directions, and make yourself a little swatch card so you can practice mixing some of these colors before you actually get into your actual painting. So I'm going to start on one side and make a slightly orangey yellow, sort of the yellowest version of the orange that I want to use, and then I'll make one that's a little more orangey and so forth until I get over to the other side and have kind of a reddish orange. So now I went across the top so you could see how this is going to be laid out, but you might actually want to do this card by going down the rows, down the columns, because now I have to remix that yellow-orange on the left side. And what I've done here is I added just a tiny touch of the complement, and you see it creates a little bit of a darker version of that yellow that's very believably the color you might see on an object that color if it has a shadow on it. And then I add a tiny bit more. That doesn't look like much of a difference. Let's add a bit more to it. And sometimes you'll find that you have to balance things out a little bit with a bit more of your red or a bit more of your yellow. As you're adding that complement, you may wind up needing to make some adjustments, but your eye knows what is believable as a shadow. And as you start to lay these down, you're going to start to look at it and go, yeah, that does kind of look like what that object, that color might look like in a shadow or on the shadow side. So I'm going to go down all 4 columns doing the same thing. I mix my top color and I add a little of the complement, a little more of the complement, balancing out with my red and yellow if I feel like I need to. Just basically on my own intuition, letting my eyes guide me. And I think you can see that this combination gives us pretty much everything that we're going to need to paint the shadow areas, including that sort of olivey part in the center. And we haven't addressed the outside, the background yet, but trust me, that one will work out too. And by the way, if I'm going to do this whole painting and focus on really making a painting out of it, I might want to do this with my greens as well, using my yellow and blue and adding a little bit of my red to each combination to make sure that I can get all the green tones that I need, and that looks like it's going to be fine. Okay, so let's get started painting. What I'm going to do here in the interest of time is make a first pass through this where I show you just the important steps, and then I'll append a somewhat longer version for those of you who want to follow along. So I'm going to start by working wet in wet, because I find one of the things watercolor does really well is help give you the illusion of form in a very out-of-focused way before you even do any real work. So here's what I mean by that. I'm going to wet the whole page. In this case, I'm wetting the whole page because the background is dark, so if any orange bleeds off the edge of the petals, it really won't matter. If you had a different contrasting color or a white background, you might choose to just wet the inside of the flower on this step. And then what I'm going to do is just sort of follow my drawing very loosely and start dropping in some of the shadow forms. Now I'm purposely using just my bright red and yellow right now. There's no complement added yet. So these shadow colors are not dark enough for the actual shadows, but they're going to start to give me some of the shape of this rose and help guide me along with my pencil marks. So at this point, maybe 3 or 4 minutes into the painting, I've got quite a bit of the illusion of depth and form here already, because our brain tries to make sense of stuff like this. And what I'm doing now is I'm lifting just a little bit of color. I want to exaggerate the value differences in the photo and see if I can maybe get even more depth than there was in the photo itself. So where I have a really light area, I'm actually lifting a little color out at this point. But this is really kind of an optional step. You wouldn't need to do this before you move on to the next step. I just like it for making soft highlights on a flower. It gives it a nice softness. And honestly, I almost would leave this as light and soft and unformed as it is, add some leaves and, call it done, maybe add just a little bit of shadowing. I prefer this sort of softer, more wet and wet look, but we're going to stick with the program because we're trying to answer the question of how to create the illusion of depth and form. So you can see, even as I'm lifting out some of these highlights, we're getting more and more of the cues that our eyes use to tell us what is in front of what's behind what, where the lights and the darks are, and you can kind of start to see the rose emerge. And then one last thing I want to do while it's all still a little bit wet is just drop in some dots in the center there for those stamens while it's wet, and they can kind of fuzz out a little bit, because I honestly don't want to get in there and paint all the little details in there. So I'm hoping that I can do a little bit of this and a little bit of some adding shadows later and get away with that, not have to paint all the details in the center. Okay, so the next thing that I've done here is I've taken some of the leaves and the stem from the photo, and I've invented a few to kind of give myself a composition. And I wanted to go ahead and put some of those leaves in a warmer, more yellow tone, the sort of bluish tone that they have in the photo. I kind of suspect that that's part of the photo being manipulated, and I prefer to have a little more color harmony, so I'm going to go ahead and put in some leaves. But the leaves are really not the main point, so I wanted to just get those in, and then we'll move on to creating the shadow forms. But one reason I wanted to show you the painting at this stage is, as I was doing this, I was thinking to myself, I really like this with a white background. And if I were not going to let myself fall into the tyranny of the photo, at this point I would be saying to myself, I'm going to reconsider, maybe I don't want that dark background. Now, that's a bit of a problem because I let things bleed over the edge. So for this version, I'm kind of committed to the dark background, because otherwise I have this weird in focus, out focus edge to my rose. But this is a place where I would look at this and go, I'm going to do another version, and it's going to be on a white background, because I really like this much better than the choice that the photographer was just given by reality. But okay, since we started this with a particular goal in mind, I'm going to just drive on, but I would be very much inclined to, reconsider and make a different creative choice. So I'm going to go ahead and put my dark background in at this point before I do the shadows on my rose, because even though I'm going to use my little viewfinder to help me see and make sure I'm getting the right colors, mixing the right colors for those shadows, I know that it will help me if I have that dark color next to them to judge against. And I don't want all the speckles in the background. I don't feel like that adds anything. So I'm just going to lay sort of a solid color. And what I'm doing here, I say solid color, but it's actually a color that wanders a little bit from a gray violet to a gray green, just so it's not completely monotonous. The biggest challenge here is usually trying to spread the paint too far, so you lose the dark color that you want. So make sure that you're carrying plenty of pigment and paint on your brush, and you're keeping a little bead going so that you're getting a nice, strong dark in your background. And I find that I never have mixed enough, so I'm going to be mixing as I go. But that's not a big problem, because I'm kind of letting the color wander from a gray-green to a gray-violet. One other tip to always keep in mind when you're doing single flowers centered like this is to invent or arrange some leaves or stems or other flowers or something, so that you break up that background wash and you don't have to go all the way around in a circle and rejoin at the other side. That's very hard to do and keep your wash going. This is much easier. I've broken it up into sections, and it's actually a more interesting composition. So before we continue, I want to point out that this is another place where I would look at this painting and say, this is way better than the photo. I don't want to follow the photo anymore. I want to go do some tests and figure out what's the minimum I could get away with adding to create my illusion of form, instead of trying to actually match what I have in the photo. But I'm going to go ahead and drive on, since this is a demo, and talk about how to get it to basically match the photo. I'm going to try not to kill all the light in it in the process. I really think it's lovely to see that sort of glow that's coming off the painting right now. And I know that getting in there and doing a lot of tight detail is going to kind of ruin some of that beautiful wet and wet effect. It needs some additional definition to blend in with the rest of the style of the painting, but I kind of hate that we're going to do a lot more to it. But okay, so I'm going to grab my viewfinder, and I'm going to start from the outside in, paint the darkest shadows first. I find that helps me establish my full range of values within the rose and not have things be too wishy-washy. So I'm using my little viewfinder and making some test samples, trying to get the correct color for that lower petal. Okay, and then I am going to just wet everything that is below the edge of those two petals above, wet the whole lower petal, and start dropping the color in. I find this is a lot less stressful for me than trying to paint the shadow shape and get in there in time to soften the edge. So I just wet the whole petal and then I drop the color in. And since these shadows are kind of soft, this works really well, lets them just kind of blend themselves into the right form. One thing to keep in mind though is that if you're wetting the petal first, that paint gets a little diluted, so you may have to drop in additional color. So I know that right now that just looks shockingly dark. It looks way too dark, but it is the correct color. I matched it using my little viewfinder. The reason it looks shockingly dark is because we kept a lot more light and drama in the rest of the painting than the photo has. So we're comparing it against a lighter color, and that's why it seems too dark to us. As you're planning where to go next, what petal you're going to work on next, keep in mind that some of these shadows sort of connect to one another. So you might have to think strategically about things like this where they all connect. You might want to do the petal that is underneath that connecting shadow first. Okay, so I'm just kind of working my way around the lower half of the flower right now, looking for places where I can add another tier of petals, and then just keeping in mind that I may need to let things dry before I go back and work in a particular area. And you might wonder, how did I decide where to start, or why am I not going all the way around the outside? So if you squint your eye at the photo right now, you'll see that all the prominent shadows are on the lower half and then right in the center. The ones on the upper half are much softer and less distinct. So that tells me that even though there's soft light on this scene, it's coming mostly from the upper part of the photo. So I want to establish those lower shadows first. Those are the most important. And then I can be very soft and vague with some of the upper ones because that's what they really are in the photo. If you squint and you can still tell it's a rose, and you can't really see where those shadows are, then that tells me I don't need much up there. So this is the important part. I want to get this right first. And I should clarify that. I mean, this is the important part for showing the depth and the form, which is our point in this exercise. Again, I am like really resisting having to add more and more and more to this painting because I really like that sense of light in the petals that haven't been painted yet. I would rather have kept that, but oh well. Okay, so this is looking very three-dimensional at this point, and I would argue slightly more three-dimensional than the photograph. So I think we're doing fine on our exercise. And now we have to go in and add the shadowing in the very center and just a little bit at the top to separate those upper petals. One thing I want to point out here is I keep rotating this painting and rotating my photos so they're always lined up together because it's easier to put the tip of the brush along that edge from this angle. So be sure if you're turning your painting, turn your photo as well so that you're looking at both in exactly the same orientation. One thing that you may notice is that there are places in this photo where it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what's going on. Is this petal folded over, or is that a shadow, or exactly what is it? You do not have to figure that out, and you do not have to spell it out for the viewer. If they could understand the photo, they can understand your painting. If you just paint the shape that's there and don't worry about whether it's part of this petal or that petal. You don't need to know. They don't need to know. You understood the photo without being able to figure that out. So don't insult your viewer or waste your own time by going in and trying to add imaginary detail to interpret what you think the photo might be. Just paint a shape that you see and let it go. Before I paint the shadow in the center of the flower, I want to remind myself to paint around some little flecks of yellow to be the stamens. So I went in and just drew some little yellow ovals above this area that's going to be in shadow, just to kind of remind myself to not paint over those and leave those as little suggestions of stamens. And I'm also darkening up a few of my pencil lines that are just kind of hard to see in there to make sure I have a good roadmap, because this is going to be a little bit of a complicated thing to paint around that center portion and not lose all the speckly nature there. And just a reminder, before I do each petal, I am checking with my little viewfinder to make sure I have the right color. It's very easy, even at this late stage, to go too light or too dark based on what's around you. And since I'm now going to put in kind of a darker area in sort of the lightest area of the painting right now, I needed to check and make sure I have the right color mix for my shadow. And then again, I'm going to do the same thing for the darkest areas in the center of the flower. I don't want to go super dark, but it's pretty dark in there, so I want to make sure that I don't go too light or I'll lose my sense of depth in the center. And now I'm again just looking at the painting and finding some little dark shapes and painting one little dark shape at a time. I'm not trying to tell a story about what this is scientifically, because I don't have that information in the photo, but I can tell it's a rose. So the viewer does not need that information in my painting to tell that it's a rose. What the viewer needs is sufficient dark in the center to establish that sense of depth. Okay, here we are kind of at the end of our exercise, and I would say that worked out pretty well. So I know this wasn't a complete paint-along demo. It was about an hour and 45 minutes of work to do this painting, mostly because I needed to kind of take some care and make sure I stayed on track of which painting or which petal I was painting. But the actual task was just sort of the same task over and over of wet the petal, drop in the shadows, use my little viewfinder to make sure I was dropping in the correct color, and magically I wind up with a sense of form. Now, when I'm going to paint on video, I very often have to do one or two dress rehearsals so I can figure out when I need to pause and what to point out. And so this is one of my rough drafts. And I'm showing you this because the colors are not dramatically different between these two finished paintings. But I used completely different pigments. For the demonstration that I just did for you, using the Watercolor Jumpstart pigments, we're using fairly transparent colors. And for the one at the bottom, the rough draft version, I was using my most opaque yellow, my most opaque red, and then I used the same cobalt blue because all of my blues are around the same opacity. I'm showing you this to try and hammer home the point that if you're having trouble getting a sense of depth or form or believable shadows, it is very rarely the case that going and buying a new paint or trying different paint combinations is going to be the solution. Usually the bigger issue is getting the values right and getting the color in the shadows right. And those colors are neutralized colors, so it's hard to tell, is that a reddish brown or an orangish brown or yellowish brown, or is it just gray? And that's why we use that little punch card viewfinder to isolate it, because no matter how hard you concentrate or how much you know, your eyes work the way your eyes work. And this thing called color constancy is built into our visual system. It's unconscious. So you have to give your eyes a little help and take away the distracting colors around it. Then you can identify the color you're really trying to mix. Now, in my examples, both of mine have more yellowy highlights because I really liked that and I just didn't want to kill it all. But you could have toned that down and gotten even closer to the photo by using the little viewfinder if you wanted to. So if you decide you want to tackle this subject, try to paint this photo and use it as an exercise, or just because you like the photo, a couple of pieces of advice. This demo took me, I think, about an hour and 45 minutes to paint, which is why it's not a paint-along. That would be a ridiculously long video to upload. And that's not so much because it's terribly difficult, but just because there's lots of little petals and I was doing each petal one at a time. So if you're new to this, you might want to give yourself maybe just a few petals and practice the shadows and getting the form and how you're going to wet them before you try tackling the whole thing. Or perhaps if you want to get a finished painting and you don't want to spend hours doing it, start with a simpler flower or a simpler orange or yellow object and see if you can get the hang of creating the believable shadows there. And then when you have more confidence, come back to a more complicated subject like this one. This isn't necessarily technically more difficult, it's just more time consuming, and so if you're unsure of your technique, you might not want to invest that much time until you have a little bit of confidence. And the second piece of advice is don't go too small. We all have this feeling that a smaller painting is less intimidating, but there's a point beyond which smaller gets a lot harder. And with something like this, postcard size would be very difficult because to get the form right, in addition to all these other things about value and so forth, you have to approximately get the shapes of the petals and the shadows sort of right. And that gets harder and harder the smaller you get because you have less wiggle room for small inconsistencies. So I'm working here on an eighth of a sheet of watercolor paper, which is 7.5 by 11, and I've taped off the sides so my image is around 7 by 10. And I wouldn't go much smaller than that. A little bigger might even be a good idea, maybe 8 by 10. And one final tip, I know it's really convenient to look at these photos on your computer screen or your tablet or phone, but if you're going to do this kind of exercise, I strongly encourage you to do what I did here and print out a copy of the photo. And the reason is, when you're trying to match colors and you're looking at a computer monitor or an iPad, you're comparing an illuminated screen that actually has light emerging from it to a piece of paper with colored marks that only gets light reflected from it. And it is extremely difficult to make that comparison and actually match those two things. They're just not the same visual experience at all. So you can learn to kind of make that adjustment, compensate, and work from a tablet. But if you're really struggling with this, give yourself some help and compare apples and apples and work from a printed copy of your photo. So I hope this is helpful. If you're an absolute beginner and this is feeling kind of overwhelming, maybe set it aside or try it with just a lemon or an orange or something very simple. But no matter where you are in your watercolor career, it's a good idea to start using that little hole punch viewfinder to check that you're really trying to mix the right color. And remind yourself that if you can't seem to get the colors right, usually the problem isn't that you're unable to mix things on the palette. It's that the color that you're mixing isn't really the color that you need, because vision is very, very dependent on what's right around that color. So use your viewfinder to isolate it, make sure your values are correct, and don't run off to the paint supply store thinking that buying a different pigment is going to solve that problem for you. So you can save some money, save some time, maybe save some frustration, and just accept that this is part of how our eyes work, and we can't change it, and it has nothing to do with being unskilled. It's just something that is, and the only thing we can do as artists is learn that that exists, that problem exists, and use little tools that help us get around it. So get your hole punch out, make yourself a little viewfinder, and I think you'll find that your shadows become a lot more believable. See you next time. Happy painting.